Hi Lars, how are you doing today?
I'm great, thanks, and thanks for inviting me.
Great, Lars. Welcome to Trademo's season 2 of Fireside Chats, where we discuss some of the most important topics around global supply chains. And as a quick round of introduction for our large audience, I'm Shalabh, founder and CEO of Trademo, a global supply chain intelligence and compliance SaaS platform. And Lars is the CEO of Vespucci Maritime, a consulting company in container shipping industry, and I would say one of the most respected thought leaders in the container shipping industry globally. Like I've seen rooms filled with 1,000, 2,000 odd people when Lars is the speaker. So very excited to have you, Lars, over here. And when we decided to launch our season 2 of Trademo's Fireside Chats, and we picked up the topic for today, which is practical implications of the global carbon emission tax on the shipping industry. I could not think of a better name than you to invite. And I'm very glad that we are able to do this in time with some of the latest news and milestones by IMO achieved a few weeks earlier. I think it's more important for the industry to have your perspective and viewpoint on this. So just to begin our conversation for today, Lars, I would like to share a quick overview of the concept of the carbon emission tax on the shipping and basically how it aims to address the climate change on a global scale. If you can just give a broad overview for our audience to understand about this topic.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can give a good grand overview because from my perspective and what I've seen also come out of the latest IMO meeting, this is going to sound slightly harsh, but I see nice talk and intentions, but not very much tangible action. And this is not necessarily to levy huge criticism at IMO. We need to remember what is IMO. IMO is a collection of basically all countries in the world. And here we get to what I think is the root of the matter. The moment you start talking about carbon tax, you are effectively also aiming at a system whereby not all, but most large countries in the world need to agree not only on some sort of, call it common taxation, but also some sort of common ground to enforce this. And I have a hard time seeing the realism of such an approach actually getting into action. If we were to look at it slightly differently, let's make two different examples to compare this to, both in terms of a carbon taxation and also in terms of enforcement. In terms of carbon taxation, the only one we have right now, de facto, that is up and running is in the EU, the Emissions Trading Scheme, or ETS as we know it. That is de facto a carbon taxation. Does it work? To some degree, yes, because all ships that do go in and out of EU, we have had for years, they have to report their emissions. You have the same legislative environment across the EU, and God knows even the EU at times have a hard time finding common ground for all the member states. So finding common ground globally is going to be even more difficult, but at least it is there. But it also shows some of the challenges. Some of the challenges here are, what are the ways with which to, I wouldn't say cheat the system because it's not cheating, but you could make port calls close to the EU and thereby reduce the reportable emissions for one element, for example. So it is there. It is being implemented. You are seeing shipping lines on the carrier side trying to implement surcharges to pass on the cost. So it can be done, but it is exceedingly difficult to get common ground. And then we also come to the enforcement part. Assume you broaden a different type of carbon tax out globally. Would you necessarily enforce it in the same way in terms of how do you measure, where should I pay? And here comes the critical question, who gets the money? And again, if we are being slightly honest here, yes, there will be money paid for the carbon emissions certificates in the EU, but you can then question, what is that money actually being used for? This will be an even greater challenge globally, where I could see a number of challenges related to who should get to administer this money. Does it go into a global IMO pool? Does some of it go to US, some of it to China, some of it to India, some of it to EU? I don't see a practical political solution on that. What I do see, however, is why don't we learn from something else completely? Let's forget carbon just for a split second and look at low sulfur. It was recognized now almost 20 years ago that sulfur emissions were also a problem, not from global warming, but this was a health issue. And what we came up with, as we all now know, was the limit for sulfur from 2020. And that is enforceable it's very simple to enforce, because basically it's an extremely simple matter. You can go on board, you can inspect the vessel and ask the question, do you have low sulfur in your tanks or not? If you do, then that's fine, you're compliant. If you don't, the next question is, do you have a functioning scrubber on board? If you do, then fine, you're compliant, otherwise you are not. That is relatively easy. Setting up a system whereby you have to measure, let's say again, stay with the sulfur emissions. If somebody had proposed, why don't you measure your sulfur emissions along the journeys, report this in, and we'll look at it. That would be a much more complicated way of doing it. If we try to make that parallel over to carbon emissions, the challenge then becomes one I think is fundamental to the decarbonization of the industry. What are the realistic fuels that we have?
Yeah.
And right now, obviously, there is not a lot of zero carbon fuels out there. It will gradually come. I'm not sure it's going to be expanded as rapidly as everybody would like it to be. But that might be a viable path going forward. Say there is a long phase-in period. And over time, there will be requirements to the fuel specifications itself. There can be transitional periods. There can be periods where there's a mandatory inclusion of biofuel. Some of that will de facto come out of the EU 25 rules coming in 25, for example. But that would make it somewhat more enforceable. And the reason I keep harping on this enforceability is this is a global industry. And I say that because it seems to me, at least sometimes at the political level, they tend to overlook what this means. That means that this industry has spent centuries perfecting how do you choose the legislation that applies to you. And the industry is extremely adept at doing so. That goes also for normal taxation purposes. It goes for purposes of what kind of crews do you need on your ships? And in the more, let's say, cynical parts of the shipping industry, what are the safety standards you need to adhere to on the ships? The industry is extremely adept at choosing the legislation that suits their purpose. So if we try to go down a path of making a global carbon taxation that is not completely effectively enforceable, that have gaps because not all countries are part of it, you will see some shipping lines definitely use those loopholes. The problem that creates is you will then skew the playing field. Suddenly you will have a massive commercial disadvantage to the companies that actually do try to decarbonize. That brings up yet another question. Again, this is a whole web of different stakeholders, because often when we talk about decarbonization, we tend to talk about the shipping lines, the ship owners, the ship operators.
Yeah.
Very rarely do we talk about the other extremely important stakeholder out there, the shippers, the customers themselves. And I can only speak from the perspective of container shipping because that's my experience and my expertise. What I have seen in recent years and what I still see to this very day is, by and large, across the board, there is essentially no willingness to pay for this. Just like caveat, sure, you can find some individual customers that are willing to do it. There are some customers that pay a slight extra for having, for example, biofuel. There are some customers that do want to pay for something, but they are by far in the minority. And the reason I'm raising that one is linked with what I just said before. If we end up with a system where shipping lines that do want to decarbonize get a commercial disadvantage because the ones that don't care and choose a legislation where they're effectively exempt from this, in a commercial environment where shippers to a large degree are unwilling to pay, that is a problem, because then the shipping lines that try to do the right thing are effectively penalized and could lose part of their market share. That is extremely problematic. That is why I think an approach where this becomes enforceable, like, for example, a low sulfur fuel, which is much easier to enforce, might be a more viable path, because that makes it much more difficult to also try to avoid some of the penalties that might occur for not being compliant. That was a long and convoluted introduction, but I think this is a topic that is not simple. It is by definition convoluted and difficult to deal with.
And that's why we have you on the show, Lars. Yeah, so I think I'm still absorbing all what you said, and a lot of questions emerge out of this. New carbon tax, which is kind of, at least in the media, this is expected to be implemented starting next year. So how they are dealing with all of this, how one prepares for these things which are still not certain, but if implemented, could have a very major impact on the shipping as a whole.
Yeah, again, there's several elements to this. First of all, in terms of, especially on the container lines and the ETS, de facto, this is already implemented. To some degree, you can argue that reporting your emissions, which is the basic work for this, has been in effect for several years. That is where the shipping lines have to report under the MRV legislation in the EU. So that has already been in place for years. So the reporting of emissions, that's not a new thing. That's already in place. The shipping lines have then tried to say, fine, what is this going to cost us? They are buying preemptively some of these certificates they have to surrender. And then they're trying to pass this cost on to the shippers. Are they successful in passing it on? That right now is a question that is almost impossible to answer. And the Red Sea is actually one of the reasons why this is impossible to answer. If you look at the progression of this, the EU ETS came into effect here from January 24. That means that the shipping lines also had these new surcharges that were applicable from January. These surcharges, it depends a little bit on carrier, but if you look in, say, Asia, Europe, they were typically between $30 and $70 per container. But at the same time, we had the Red Sea. So we saw spot rates increase by $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. So in that context, whatever effect we could see from the carbon taxation has drowned completely in the wave of other events. Incidentally, there's a sense of déjà vu. We talked about just before the low sulfur implementation in 2020. Same approach. By late 2019, the carriers introduced low sulfur fuel surcharges. And they were going into effect in early 2020 at exactly the same time that we saw the pandemic come. So again, we saw spot rates escalate by thousands of dollars due to the pandemic, making it almost impossible to see what was actually the effect of some of these surcharges. So whether carriers can effectively pass this through, you can't quite ascertain it from just looking at the rate developments. I'm sure if you ask the container lines, most of them would likely say, yes, absolutely, we're getting these surcharges paid. But at least on the container shipping side, that is relatively meaningless. If it's a weak market, what you typically would see is a customer come to you and say, okay, my freight rate is $2,000. Now you want another $50 for this new surcharge. Sure, I'm going to pay the new surcharge if you give me a $50 discount on the base rate. So in the carrier's financial systems, they can show, yes, the surcharges are getting paid in full, but it's a relatively meaningless statement because the surcharge is not isolated de facto from the base rate. So that's part of how the carriers go about at least implementing it. Seen from a shipper perspective, this is almost impossible to get a handle on. I get that. And realistically, you will never get transparency because from a container shipping perspective, there is a problem. The carbon tax is levied on the vessel. But unlike, for example, in tankers and bulkers, I can have 500 different customers on board that same vessel. So the critical issue on container shipping is, how do I apportion this down to the individual container? And I can do that in many ways. There is not one single correct way of doing it. I could say, fine, the ship has 20,000 slots. I'm just going to divide by 20,000. That'll be one way. The problem here is the ship is not always full. So the cost associated with the empty slots, what do I do with those? I could choose to apportion it to myself as a shipping line and pay it. I could say I'm going to apportion it only on the full containers on the ship. But that brings another question. What do I do on the backhaul where the ship is always just half full? How do I apportion between head haul and backhaul? What do I do with transshipment cargo that's only on the ship for half of the journey? This is not rocket science. I can easily devise it. Well, I should do it this way, but I can also devise it in a different way, and in a third way, and in a fourth way. And that to some degree is also what we're seeing out there. Carriers are choosing different ways to apportion the costs downwards. It's not that any of the carriers are doing anything wrong. It's just there is no single correct way of doing it. It becomes a matter of choice. So from a shipper perspective, this just looks like a nightmare. How can I understand this? And that's where, again, it becomes tricky for the carriers to pass through some of these surcharges. But then again, to add yet another perspective into this mess, think back to late 2023, before the Red Sea crisis. Everybody was beginning to wake up to the fact that this is going to cost money. And you also saw a number of headlines also in the shipping press. Oh my God, this is going to be extremely expensive. And you were also beginning to hear ruminations from shippers saying, hang on a second, these surcharges you're coming with, there's no way we can pay them. This becomes far too expensive. We heard the same in 2019 when it came to the low sulfur. And yet, both in 2020 with the pandemic and now with the Red Sea, we have seen price increases of thousands of dollars. I'm not saying that doesn't hurt the shippers, it absolutely does. But it does bring it into perspective that despite these massive increases, both in the pandemic and now after the Red Sea, it's not that global trade has stopped.
Yep.
Some individual shippers are clearly under pressure, but the majority of the market is handling it. So I'm also just trying to point out that yes, we do have price increases from, in this case, the EU carbon tax, but those increases are relatively minor compared to some of the shocks the industry, time and time again, are apparently perfectly capable of handling.
Interesting. Lars, you talked about a lot of practical challenges in implementing something like a global carbon emission tax. And that brings me to the question, a very basic one, that when someone like IMO is doing this on a global scale, consulting with several member states, getting a consensus and devising this policy as a framework over the years, do you think these kind of practical challenges would have been voiced by major container lines, major shippers, or they would have been hearing this already? Or
I'm sure they will have been airing it, but this is also where we need to recognize that especially different sectors of shipping appear not to necessarily have the same interests.
Okay.
You have some sectors, now I'm potentially generalizing a bit too much, but it appears to me that one of the more progressive sectors is the container shipping sector. Not all companies in the sector, but as a sector. Right. Whereas you then have other sectors over in, for example, bulk and tank, that are not necessarily moving as fast as the container shipping. Right. They would have been voicing different views on what they would like to see going forward, what is realistic going forward. And if you then look within the container shipping sector, it's also clear that some of the more progressive lines, take a Maersk, for example, they have for years been pushing the view they want more regulation, they want more legislation, which from their perspective makes all the sense in the world. Because if you want to be moving rapidly on this in an environment where there's limited willingness to pay by shippers, and therefore an enormous upside for shipping lines that don't want to go down this path and have extra cost, the only way you can then push this agenda is there has to be a level playing field for all, and that requires regulation. Logically, that makes perfect sense. The challenge I have with this is, if we're honest, this is an industry where there has never been a level playing field. And that goes beyond what we talk about now. Something as simple as government subsidies. I mean, there is plenty of issues with government subsidies in the industry to start with, and they take many guises, many shapes and forms. It can be government subsidies in terms of access to loan guarantees. It can be government subsidies in terms of subsidies for building vessels at favorable prices. It can be outright loans under favorable conditions. It can be favorable taxation conditions. There's a whole web of elements out there that just means this is not a level playing field. And that might be me being slightly cynical, but I don't see a level playing field when it comes to the carbon competition either. And then again, we come back to the IMO being a collection of states. I see a global development where the world is becoming more fragmented, not more united. The geopolitical tensions out there, to me, signals it's going to be harder, not easier, to get consensus in all kinds of international fora, where IMO is just one of them.
Very interesting. Last, you touched upon Musk being investing in more sustainable innovation, and can you talk a little bit more about it, about our audience, that what kind of innovation you have seen in the past, which is not levied by taxes and not incentivized by the government, but some of these players like Musk or others have themselves taken initiatives, just for our audience to understand.
Yeah.
About
to give the, I mean, again, I just speak for the container shipping sector here. What we have seen, I would say, over the last 15 years or more, is that all shipping lines have reduced their emissions dramatically. The incentive is very, very clear: money. The best way to reduce my emissions is to reduce my fuel consumption, to make vessels more effective. And the shipping lines have been incredibly effective at doing this. That is a major motivational driver for a lot of them. That means we have seen modifications to bulbous bows. We have seen modifications to the shapes of the hulls. We're beginning now to see ships with, you've seen some of these massive screens up front that help with some of the wind resistance. We have seen a lot of technical innovation on the engine side. All of this has been driven by, can you save fuel? Because that saves you money. Obviously, that also reduces innovation. I think that's a good example where the two agendas go hand in hand. The challenge here is that is still using conventional fuels. And that will not help to get to zero carbon. It will reduce, and it continues to reduce. We're seeing massive fleet renewal with all the new ships that are coming on, but they're still fossil fuel ships. So it will still reduce, but not bring us towards zero. The step towards zero, the problem here is that includes a cost increase. The green fuels are much more expensive than the fossil fuels right now. That is the hurdle. And I think this is where a lot of this discussion, also regulation, then comes in. Because as long as you're saving money by saving fuel, the industry does a perfectly good job on their own on going down that path. But the green fuels, they're expensive and they're in short supply. And then we come back to my point from before. What do we then do when shippers, by and large, are unwilling to pay? I have sometimes seen then voices say, well, then we need to make it visible to the consumers what this is, which sounds great. But again, I don't see that being realistic. Let's say, for sake of argument, you go down to the supermarket and you look at a tin of tomatoes or a pair of trousers. What are you going to do with that tin of tomatoes? Well, the aluminum was made in Bahrain, then it was moved over to Turkey to be turned into cans. Then you had the tomatoes that were shipped from 3 different countries. Then it was all put together in a plant in Greece, partly on a ship, partly on a truck, sometimes moving on a barge. Not only the practicalities of calculating what is the emission on this, how do we want to make a label that makes sense for the consumer? And then here, well-meaning people say, well, make it simple. Put us a green, yellow, red sticker on, but we got so many other stickers on goods already. I certainly get the intention of it. The intention is well-meaning, but I don't see a practical, realistic path.
Let's check. Last, you mentioned about money being an incentive for creating more efficiencies or more efficient use of the fuel, but obviously fuel is the challenge. Currently, like we are still using mostly fossil fuels. So, other than this, do you see any other opportunities or any other examples which you have seen in the industry where more sustainability related initiatives have been successful, or basically reducing the carbon emission? Either, again, money being an incentive, cost efficiency, or some other incentive, but that has been successful with any container line?
It's hard to say it has been successful. You have seen some shipping lines. I think Hapag-Lloyd was the first, I'm not quite sure, but where you then as a shipper could buy a biofuel add-on, which means that, okay, fine, we're not solving the problem for the entire industry, but as an individual shipper, you could do something about your carbon emissions. It is successful in the sense that it is available. I am not so sure it's successful in terms of how many then actually choose to pay for this.
And plus, among EU ETS, as you mentioned, it's already being implemented, and the overall discussions which are happening around global carbon emission tax. How do you see this all impacting intermediaries like NVOCCs and freight forwarders? Do you see any kind of direct impact over there?
No. Basically, when it comes to the NVOCCs and the freight forwarders, I was about to say they're caught in the middle. They're caught in the middle between what is the shipping lines actually offer versus what is the willingness to pay on behalf of their customers further down the line. They can, of course, then try to devise products and tell their customers, if we move with this carrier, it's more advantageous than if we move with that carrier. They can definitely offer that, but they can't necessarily force the customers to then choose what solutions they want to go down. And when you talk about other stakeholders, there's yet another stakeholder, one we haven't really talked much about yet either. And that's again the fuel producers. Because this is, in my mind, the Achilles heel. We need much more investments to go in and build the facilities to create the green fuels. The green fuel that right now is the most implementable, let's put it that way, would be the green methanol. To which degree, for example, ammonia or nuclear will be used, I think that is a much longer time frame. But I have not seen anybody come up with a realistic time frame of building enough industrial facilities to decarbonize the entire shipping industry. Take the number with a grain of salt, because I haven't been able to get to the bottom of it, but ballpark, I think we need something like 800 million tons of green fuel if it's methanol per year. Right now we are producing, I think it's on the order of tens of thousands of tons per year. So this is an extremely daunting task. I see a lot of focus again on the shipping lines. What kind of vessels are they ordering? What are they doing? But I don't see near enough pressure over on the industrial side. Who is realistically going to produce this? And without the fuel, we can build as many green ships as we want. That's where the shipping lines are at least realistic as well. The ones they built that are genuinely green ship are dual fuel capable. So they can still run on fossil fuels, because otherwise you're going to be stuck with a ship and no fuel. That makes perfect sense. So I think we need either more pressure or more economic incentives to build these industrial facilities much more rapidly than what we're seeing out in the market.
So one of the argument on global carbon emission tax was that it will end up generating tens of billions of dollars of revenue whenever implemented. And a part of that revenue is going to go in development of these alternate, more green fuels. But as you mentioned, like the overall implementation seems to be very challenging. But you see that IMO engaging with these stakeholders, the fuel providers in some way, and to kind of incentivize them in development of more green fuels. Do you see that happening?
In theory, you could say it again is one of those where it sounds good. Let's create this giant pool of money administered by, for example, the IMO or whatever fund is being set up to do it, and they can then invest this in green technology. But I think what we're going to come up against is, and this varies from country to country, from part of the world to part of the world, what level of trust do people have that these many billions of dollars that are being paid in tax is effectively being used to the purpose it's set is being used? And what is the level of trust that it is the right companies, the right technologies that are being invested in? To some degree, it is, no, it's not a subversion, but it's saying that we don't believe the free market is working. So let's set up this giant one body that will guide everything because that is a lot better. I'm not sure there's going to ever be consensus around such a model. And you can say, that is why, let me pull it back to what I said initially. Why don't we learn from, again, the low sulfur?
Okay.
Where we said we want to reduce sulfur emissions. And that means we're going to measure what is the fuel on board. Or do you have a scrubber for that matter? That is easy to implement, but we are not interfering in how do we come up with these solutions. To some degree, and of course, it will likely require a much longer transition period than what we saw for low sulfur. But strictly speaking, there might not be many technical challenges in saying, fine, you need to have fuel of specific types on board, or we need to see that you have a carbon capture device on board the vessel, or you're simply non-compliant. That would then push it back to the industry. What are you then going to do?
Interesting. And Lars, as a part of the overall decarbonization, and a lot of shippers, corporates reporting their overall emissions, including scope 3 emissions, right? So they need a lot of visibility in their emissions during the shipping as well. What kind of developments do you see there in being effectively being able to measure the overall carbon emissions as far as shipping is concerned for the shippers? And
this is where, again, I see a problem. Again, a very practical problem, specifically here on the container shipping side.
Right.
Because you can measure the emissions on a ship. Sure, there are issues with that as well, but let's, for the sake of argument, say I can measure precisely the emissions on my ship. But again, we come to this, how do I apportion it to the individual shipper? So I am just importing 8 containers with garden tools. What are my emissions? That becomes critically dependent on this allocation method. And what we are seeing, not just now, but have seen for years, even when container shipping lines used the same methodology, they ended up with different results on a per TEU level. This has led to a situation where multiple different freight forwarders right now have their own methodologies. So at least within that freight forwarder, it's now like for like when you compare carriers, but then you can't compare across freight forwarders. That has led to the advent also of third-party information providers. They say, well, if you use our methodology, then you can compare. But I've got different third-party providers now arriving at different results. So what are you to do if you are a shipper? Here's the issue. I need to report my emissions. And I need to also basically be able to document that these numbers are not pulled out of a hat, that they come from some verified methodology. But what do you then do when there is a multitude of different verified methodologies out there giving different results? The shipper is left with a simple choice. Look at the different methodologies, and then I just choose one. And I would certainly not be interested in a discussion in terms of whether that is the one true sole correct way of measuring, because as I mentioned, there is not just one way, there are multiple ways of actually doing this. That's the challenge. And I think you're going to see a stratification. You will see some shippers that are genuinely interested in tracking their performance.
Yeah.
They will evaluate the methodologies, and then they'll make a choice and say, this is the one we're going to use. And then they're going to stick with that methodology for a number of years, because then you can genuinely track. I would also have a sneaky suspicion that you will find shippers that do another thing. They'll say, we're going to choose this methodology, and the year later, they will look and say, oh my God, our emissions have increased. However, If we choose methodology number 2, this is a lower number. So why don't we change methodology? We can always argue that methodology number 2 is better for reasons X, Y, and Z. That is going to happen as well.
Interesting. And I mean, last to what you just said, it looks like there's a lot of standardization which is required here. Do you see any specific bodies playing an important role in driving more standardization as far as reporting of carbon emissions during the shipping is concerned?
I think the one that has been there also the longest is the Clean Cargo Work Group, and they were basically the first ones to try to set a standard on how do you measure emissions also on a per TEU level. And they did a lot of good work. I mean, they've been around for more than 20 years now. So as I say, they're one of the foremost ones to set such a standard. The challenge with that is, even given that standard, for the 15 years that it's been around, we could still find examples of shipping lines that used that same standard, that same methodology, yet kept coming up with significantly different numbers because there were different ways in which you could use that standard.
Okay. And why do you think not enough focus is being put by bodies like IMO on this topic, on the standardization of measuring and reporting carbon emissions from the shipping?
I'm not sure why there isn't. I mean, I'm sure there is focus on that as well, but here again we come down to the practical reality of it. With the IMO having almost 200 different countries, lots of different stakeholders, all pulling in different directions, it is not easy to find traction. And again, to maybe place things slightly into context, remember when we had the verified gross mass got implemented in, well, that's more than 10 years ago now. But that was a process that took roughly 20 years in the IMO. 20 years to agree that, yes, it would be mandatory that we know the weight of a container before we put it on a ship, which, seen from the outside, sounds like an incredibly simple thing to do, yet it's a process that took decades to get in. So it's something much more complicated that we're talking about now. That's why I am not specifically hopeful that you're going to see meaningful ways of handling this unless you boil it down again to something very simple like we did with the low sulfur. And let's not forget, I mean, the IMO does not operate in a vacuum. When it comes to decarbonization, that is a highly politicized topic in every country around the world, and it cannot be, for shipping alone, detached from that wider political discussion as well, where clearly different countries have varying agendas in terms of how rapidly they want to move and how they want to move and how they want to address it.
And Lars, if I am a freight forwarder or an NVOCC and I need to prepare my business either from the perspective of shippers' expectations in being able to track or measure their carbon emissions effectively, or in the larger realm of new taxes like EU ETS, or let's say possibly the global carbon emission tax, what should be my strategy for next 12 months? Do I need to worry about what should I work on?
Yeah, the one thing, I mean, if you're sitting as the middleman, as an NVOCC or freight forwarder, you need, of course, if you don't have it already, the ability to tell your customers what's the carbon emissions. And as a freight forwarder, the ideal approach would be either you have your own way of doing it, but that's only for the very largest to do that, or you find a third party and find this is how we're going to set it up, this is how we're going to measure it. Because it's a matter of saying, find how many tons of CO2 for your shipment. When it then comes to the taxation part of it, there's not really much the freight forwarders can do apart from warning their customers that, well, we're keeping an eye out on what are the surcharges that are coming from the carriers, and say we're going to have to pass these surcharges through. When it then comes to predicting the surcharges, I think we are going to see a significant increase in the EU ETS. That is just my personal view. And here's why. Right now, there are two things we need to recall about the ETS. First of all, it's a phased-in approach. Right now, carriers are only paying 40% of what they should here in 24. That then becomes 70%, then becomes 100% in 26. Secondly, the way the ETS works, I am taxed on 50% of the journey to and from EU ports, from non-EU ports. So if I go, say, Shanghai to Rotterdam, I'm liable to pay carbon tax for half of that journey. Same thing going back. So far, so good. Here's where I see the problem come in, and that comes from the Red Sea. Obviously, going around Africa is a much, much longer journey.
Yep.
And the reporting of emissions in EU only takes place once a year in the beginning of the year. So sometime during Q1 2025, we're going to see the carbon emissions for 2024 reported by the carriers.
Right.
Those carbon emissions will now include going around Africa. This is not going to be a minor thing. I actually did some calculations here over the weekend. If I look only at what has happened until now, and let's assume the Red Sea opens up for transit tomorrow, this alone will result in an 8% increase in carbon emissions reported to the EU. If this continues for the rest of the year, we could potentially be looking at 25 to 28% increase. The 8% increase alone, that's already happened, that brings the emissions, again, not global emissions, this is the reportable emissions in the EU. That brings the emissions back to the level we last saw in 2019. That's 5 years of emissions reductions that have now been negated purely because of the Red Sea. And this gets worse. This becomes, in my view, a political issue then sometime in spring 2025. The political level is going to look at this and say, hang on a second. Here we have an industry that promised to reduce emissions, that we have pressured to reduce emissions through, for example, ETS, yet emissions are increasing. Of course, the fact here is that's because we have to go around Africa. There is no choice. But I think at a political level, there'll be much more focus on, well, you're increasing emissions. So clearly what we have been doing so far is not enough. We need to do more.
Oh.
And again, this is just my guess on what will transpire. Somebody will look and say, well, the problem is now you go all the way around Africa, but you're only paying tax on half of it because it's only 50% of the emissions, Shanghai, Rotterdam. Why are you only paying half of the added emissions? Maybe you should pay full or something else. I think there'll be an enormous pressure in 2025, specifically in the EU, to amp up the pressure on shipping because they will see shipping as going in the wrong direction. Shipping will come out also factually and point out this is due to events completely outside of their control. It's the Red Sea problem. But this is going to be a political issue and not an issue discussing supply chain facts.
And with all these developments happening, Lars, do you see any implications on the spot and contract rates and maybe how shippers should think about it?
You can say the way this has been approached, and I don't think that is necessarily going to change, is the carriers have done what they always do when there are new elements coming in, they create new surcharges. So we got the new ETS surcharges, and I think that's how they're going to continue to handle it.
So you believe rates going higher in the coming quarters, 2025?
Yeah, you can say for the ETS charges, they are going to go higher because they're going to reflect also going around Africa. And as the years progress, they will certainly go higher as the ETS goes from 40 to 70 to 100%. And that is going to be applicable both in spot, and you're going to see it applicable in contracts as well. This is no different than how the carriers also try to have bunker adjustment surcharges or whatever fancy names they give to them.
And Lars, you made a point around world being fragmented, more fragmented than ever, and we all are seeing it, right? It would be very helpful for our audience to understand some quick takeaways from your end, like what do you see the practical implications of it in next few quarters of the overall development which is happening?
There's a lot of different developments unfolding at the same time. I mean, part of the fragmented world, it's just a symptom what we're seeing down in the Red Sea. A fragmented world is gradually leading to more and more conflict around the world. This is just one that is particularly nasty from the perspective of the supply chain. But even prior to that, we're beginning to see also a split out where there was a much more growth coming out of especially the Indian subcontinent as opposed to China. We were beginning to see also a move of goods away from China down towards Southeast Asia. This changes some of the trade lanes that are vital around the world. I would also expect that the trade war that is still going on between US and China might get worse as a result of the American presidential campaign coming up. And I think one thing we should remember here is that likely doesn't matter who becomes president. It was former President Trump that started the trade war, but we should also remember when President Biden came in, they continued the trade war and implemented more of it that was put in place. So I don't think it matters who they end up choosing over in the US. We are likely to see an intensification of the trade war. And again, that increases some of the tension we see around the world, shifts some of the trade corridors. On top of that, I mean, I spend most of my time out on the road in all sorts of different places of the world to get a feel for also what is happening supply chain wise. And especially, I would say, over the last year, I think the best way I can describe it is I see a slight change in sentiment. The moment I get outside of Europe and outside of North America, a change in sentiment that basically is, we will do what is best for us. I mean, why should we be dictated to by especially Europe and North America what we should do and what is good for us? We will do what is good for our country or for our region. And this is where, again, this ties over to the whole decarbonization discussion. I don't see most of the rest of the world as heavily invested politically in that discussion as Europe and North America is. And then we come full circles where we started this whole talk here today. I don't see a very practical approach where all major countries in the world can agree on a common type of carbon taxation, because there will be other larger political issues that will simply interfere with this.
That is I would say, a very different perspective that we have gathered today, which is not being discussed. And I think thanks for being very open to answer all of these questions and kind of help our audience get a more deep view on this topic and understand the different scenarios which could play out in the coming quarters. My final question for you, Lars, what kind of container lines or intermediaries or shippers in general do you think would do better in current times, basis all the changes which are happening in the container trade and obviously all the geopolitical scenarios? Any comments on that?
Now, you say I'm not going to put names on individual carriers, but I would rather look at it differently and say there are clearly different approaches to this. And let's just look at two to exemplify two of the perhaps outliers here. On one hand, you have a Maersk that clearly has gone down a path where they don't want to order new ships unless they can be net zero. That is one approach. That, of course, does not preclude them from growing. You can then charter in vessels if you want along the line. But clearly, they say if we're going to achieve net zero at the end of the day, we should only order net zero vessels. That is great if you have a long-term perspective, but it doesn't really help very much right here and now today, because it's relatively few vessels that will genuinely can sail completely green, also when you need the fuel, out of a fleet of 700. Then you can compare it to a line like MSC, for example. MSC is much less down that path, but what MSC has been doing is they have been ordering a massive amount of new state-of-the-art ships. They are using fossil fuel, so they will never be net zero on those ships. But that means that they will likely reduce their carbon emissions significantly in the very near term, because as you get these new, much more fuel-efficient vessels in, that will reduce emissions right here and now. So I'm not saying one approach is correct, the other is wrong, but they give different impact. One is an impact where in the long term, that makes it more likely you're going to reach net zero. But the other one is one that actually reduces emissions more here and now when you see across the entire fleet that's been operated. So I would expect there's going to be a war of words or a war of marketing across a number of the container lines where some will focus more on their journey towards net zero in the long run, whereas others will focus on what are the reductions that they are getting right here and now.
Interesting. And any final comments for our audience, Lars, before we wrap up our discussion for today on the overall sustainability, how they should think about it?
On the overall sustainability, I think the way to think about this one is, first of all, I mean, there will be more regulation. There is going to be more costs coming. That one is fairly self-evident. And for the shippers out there, at least the ones that are serious about reducing their own supply chain emission reductions, what they should focus on is recognize that there is a multitude of different ways to measure your emissions. Take a look at it, choose the one that you find is right for you, and then stick with it for a long period of time. Because if you start to change methodology, then all kind of measurements do you reduce becomes absolutely meaningless. If you're serious about it, do your homework, choose the methodology that fits your business best, and then stick to that methodology.
Interesting. So thanks for being with us, Lars, today. Thoroughly enjoyed it and learned a lot. I think got a whole new perspective on this, and I'm sure our audience would have learned a lot from this. So would love to have you again on our podcast soon.
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you.